Do you believe there are times when what destroys a person isn't a flying bullet, nor a knife flashing in the dark, but the scornful stares and mocking laughter of a crowd, a laughter sharp enough to cut into the soul, leaving a person wishing they could vanish rather than stand in shame before so many eyes? Out here on the frontier, where dry earth alone can break the strongest backs, there is still something colder than the north wind and harsher than the burning sun: public humiliation. And on one sweltering noon in Lo Seamus, it stood plain and cruel for everyone to see. Before I take you deeper into this story, let me pause just a moment. If these opening words already strike something inside you, if they remind you of a time when the silence of others cut deeper than any wound, go ahead and press that like button to keep these frontier stories alive. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, maybe a breezy porch out in the country, or a small room tucked away in the city. I promise you this, if you ride with me until the end, you'll see why a poor, worn-down farmer chose to stand against a whole town because of one woman's eyes. The marketplace at Lo Seamus, that hot noon, was heavy with dust and heat. Wagons creaked, mules brayed, merchants shouted about their corn, and drunken laborers laughed too loud. In the middle of the square, a rough wooden platform had been thrown together, tall enough for the entire crowd to gawk at. On it stood an Apache woman, her wrists bound raw by rope. Her deerskin dress was torn, dirt streaking across her arms and shoulders. Black hair fell in tangles across her face, but it could not hide the look in her eyes, hard yet hollow, defiant yet drowning. The men below were no respectable buyers. They were idlers, bottles in hand, their mouths full of jeers. They elbowed one another, laughed when the auctioneer banged his palm on a crate and shouted, "Who'll start me off, strong enough to work if she doesn't run? Don't be shy." Gentlemen, no one raised a hand. Only whistles, only sneers. A big-bellied farmer hollered, "Not worth a single dime." The crowd howled with laughter, sharp and cutting. The woman flinched, her body trembling, but her jaw locked tight as if she'd rather die than let them see her tears. It was then that Thomas Hale walked in, a man in his 40s, shoulders bent from years of plowing dead soil. His shirt was coarse and dusty, boots worn thin, hat brim pulled low across a sunburnt face. He had come only to buy nails, maybe a sack of seed if luck stretched his few coins far enough, instead of corn. What he found before him was a sight that twisted his gut. His eyes stopped on the Apache woman, and as if drawn by some invisible cord, she lifted hers to meet his. For one fleeting moment, the noise of the crowd fell away. There were only two gazes: hers, nearly emptied of hope, and his, heavy with loss he'd carried too long. Her cracked lips moved. Barely sound at all. Don't spend your money on me." A whisper like dry wind through grass, part plea, part warning. Thomas felt it strike his chest like the echo of his dead wife's voice, those fevered nights when she had asked him silently not to leave her side. He gripped the 3 coins in his pocket. They weren't just money. They were winter's survival, the thin line between holding his roof together or watching it collapse. They were the difference between sowing corn in spring and facing bare fields. Yet as he looked at her, a woman turned into a spectacle, laughter cutting her like knives. He knew he stood at a crossroads he hadn't chosen. The crowd kept taunting, "Leave her, Apache's no better than a wolf in the hills." The voices pressed in, but Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there, sweat down his spine, eyes locked with hers. In them he read humiliation so raw he felt it himself. The auctioneer slammed his hand again. "No bids. Then she's worth nothing. I'll hand her off to the teamsters for sport." A chill swept down Thomas's back. He knew what he was about to do would change everything. His calloused hand slid from his pocket. 3 coins caught the sunlight. Laughter burst from the crowd. "Look at the fool, spends his last silver on nothing." Thomas didn't turn. He didn't answer. He held the coins high, jaw set. In that moment, mercy outweighed reason. The auctioneer's slap on the crate rang out like a gunshot. The deal was sealed. The Apache woman Nayeli was his. No applause followed. Only coarse laughter that bit into the air, echoing after him as if to brand him a fool forever. But in Thomas Hale's chest, the decision had already rooted itself. He had spent his last coin not for gain, not for pride, but because he could not watch another soul be broken by shame. The 3 coins in Thomas Hale's hand were not just metal. They were the last scraps of a dying harvest. The thin breath of an old mule nearly spent. The only chance left to sow seed come spring. Any sensible man would have clutched them tight, like a drowning soul holding fast to driftwood. Yet Thomas's hand trembled as he lifted them, the silver glinting under the noon sun, and the crowd burst into cruel laughter. "This fool's bound to starve," one voice jeered. "An Apache woman's nothing but a burden," another added, setting off a fresh round of hoots and whistles. Nayeli still stood on the platform, eyes wide, lips quivering. She shook her head desperately, whispering again, almost breaking into tears. "Don't. Please don't do this." But Thomas did not lower his hand. He knew he was throwing his own survival into the fire, but he also knew if he walked away, his conscience would never let him rest. In her eyes brimming with humiliation and fear, he saw the shadow of Mary, his late wife, those last fevered days when she had begged him with silence not to leave her side. For a heartbeat, the Lo Seamus marketplace hushed. Then the auctioneer's palm slapped the crate, sharp as a hammer stroke sold to the poor farmer there. The crowd roared again with laughter, some whistling, others spitting in the dirt, as if their greatest joy was to turn mercy into a joke. But Thomas stepped forward in silence, his hand heavy as he dropped the 3 coins into the auctioneer's palm. The sound of metal striking wood rang sharp and cold, marking a turn in his life that could not be undone. When the knife cut the rope, the strands fell loose and raw welts stood out red across Nayeli's wrists. She rubbed them gingerly, as if still unsure she was truly free. Growls and mutters rose from the men below, but Thomas never looked back. He only shrugged off his worn coat and held it out. Nayeli hesitated, then pulled it around her shoulders, the long hem hiding the torn dress. Her face bent low. They stepped down from the platform to a path of whispers. Folks shifted aside, but not without smirks and muttered curses. "Hale's gone mad. He bought himself nothing but trouble." Each word was a knife between the shoulders, but Thomas answered none of it. He only pulled his hat down tighter and kept walking. At the mule hitch, he offered his hand to help Nayeli climb into the wagon. His touch was rough but careful, nothing of possession in it, only enough to steady a trembling body. She settled against the sideboard, clutching his coat close, eyes darting toward him now and then, wary as a bird unsure of its cage. Thomas checked the harness straps, palm brushing the cracked leather, and drew a deep breath. He felt the full weight of what he had just done. No nails, no seed, no money left to carry him through the winter. Only a woman the town had called worthless, whom he had claimed in front of them all. And yet, when he climbed up onto the wagon seat, reins in hand, and their eyes met for a fleeting moment, the heaviness in his chest lifted. In the midst of jeers and loss, one thing remained untouched: compassion. The old mule lurched forward, wheels grinding slow over stone. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the laughter until it faded to nothing but memory. For a long stretch there was no sound but hooves and wheels. Then Nayeli's voice came, quiet as wind over grass. "Why, you owed me nothing." Thomas's grip tightened on the reins, his eyes fixed ahead. Words tangled in his throat. Finally, he muttered, couldn't let them laugh any longer. It was no full answer, but it stilled her. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of shame, but something else like a fragile flame in the dark, faint yet steady enough to hold. As the ragged rooftops of Lo Seamus fell away behind them, Thomas knew he had crossed a line no man could step back from. By nightfall, every farmhouse within 10 miles would be talking of the fool who threw away his last silver on an Apache woman. But as the wagon rattled toward the barren hills, the wind in his ears carried no laughter, only the steady whisper of his own heart, heavy but unyielding, repeating the truth he could not escape: there are coins a man spends not to survive, but to keep his soul from being lost. The road from Lo Seamus to Thomas Hale's farm stretched nearly 8 miles, a distance he knew by heart, but which felt heavier than ever that day. In the wagon, Nayeli sat still as a shadow, clutching tightly at the edges of the coat he had given her. Every so often her eyes flicked toward him, wary, as though any movement on his part might be a trap. Thomas said nothing. He only kept the reins steady, letting the old mule drag the wagon over brittle brush and cracked earth. By late afternoon, the barren rows of his fields came into sight. The cabin roof sagged low, patched here and there with tar and canvas, standing lonely in a stretch of gray soil. To Thomas, it was home. But he wondered, for a woman fresh from the auction block, if it would feel like any less of a prison. The wagon creaked to a stop at the door. Thomas climbed down, then offered his hand. Nayeli hesitated, her eyes darting to the calloused, scarred palm. At last, she let her hand rest lightly in his, just long enough for him to steady her down. The brief touch made her flinch, and she pulled back quickly. Thomas said nothing, only gave a short nod and pushed open the door, hinges groaning. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the scent of old smoke clinging to the walls. A rough table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a stove blackened with ash, and a few jars of beans and cornmeal on a crooked shelf. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone, counting every meal, every stick of firewood. Thomas stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. She lingered, then crossed the threshold, her bare feet curling against the hard, cold floor. "Sit," Thomas muttered, his voice low and rough, more command than invitation. He set a tin cup of water on the table, then crouched by the stove. Sparks caught, flames licking to life, throwing long shadows across the walls. Nayeli kept her eyes on the door, as though measuring the distance she would need if she had to run. Thomas scooped a handful of dry beans into a pot, poured water, and set it over the fire. He asked no questions. Hunger left no room for choice. When the beans were soft, he ladled a bowl, placed it before her. "Eat." She stared at the bowl, then at him, suspicion and gratitude warring in her eyes. Slowly, she lifted it, sipping small spoonfuls, her hands trembling not from weakness, but from the habit of someone who had learned never to take food for granted. As she ate, Thomas reached under the bed and drew out an old pair of shoes. The leather was cracked, but they would hold. He set them before her. "Wear them. Better than bare feet." Nayeli looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. For the first time, her gaze softened slightly. She nodded once and bent to put them on. Too large, but she laced them tight, unwilling to refuse the small gift. Night fell fast. Thomas spread an extra blanket over the bed, then said, "That's yours. I'll take the chair." Nayeli's eyes stayed fixed on him, long and searching, as though waiting for the trick to reveal itself. But Thomas only dragged the chair near the stove, hung his coat over the back, and sat down, pulling a boot into his lap to mend with thick thread. For a while she stood by the bed, clutching the blanket's edge, watching him work his bent back, his scarred hands guiding the needle through worn leather, his tired eyes focused only on the task. There was no claim in his look, no demand, just the presence of a man roughened by years of work and silence. For the first time since the jeering crowd, she felt the tension in her chest ease, if only a fraction. She lowered herself onto the bed at last. The fire popped in the stove, casting light on the red welts around her wrists, on Thomas's face bent over his work. Suspicion lingered, but the raw fear began to give way to something else, an uneasy question of whether this man might be different. That night, in the small cabin, the wind pressed against the shutters, mingling with the sound of 2 steady breaths. One kept his distance, careful not to cross a line. The other remained wary, but no longer shrank from every motion. And between them, though the space was wide, it had quietly grown just a little smaller. The next morning, frost lay white on the ground, and smoke from the stove drifted slant in the wind. Thomas Hale had been up long before dawn, his heavy boots crunching the damp earth as he tightened the mule's harness. When he stepped back inside the cabin, he found Nayeli sitting at the edge of the bed, still wrapped in his old coat, her dark eyes tired. But unlike the night before, she no longer curled away like a frightened shadow. She lifted her head and looked at him, if only for a moment, as though weighing him anew. He set 2 tin buckets down. "Water," he said simply, handing her one while he took the other. The path to the creek stretched half a mile, rough and uneven. Nayeli walked slowly, her hand trembling beneath the weight, but she never complained. From time to time, Thomas glanced back and saw her small frame pressing on with quiet stubbornness. At the water's edge, he showed her how to tilt the bucket and just so, to let the current fill without spilling. She tried, nearly lost it, but steadied herself in time. By the time they trudged back, both breathing hard, Thomas gave a short nod. Good. Just one word, yet it lit her eyes as though he had offered something more. When the water was stored, they turned to the fence. A storm weeks before had bent the posts and loosened the wire. Thomas dug, set the stakes, wound the strands tight. His motions were slow, deliberate, for her to follow. When it came her turn, the wire cut into her palm, drawing a thin bead of blood. She hissed, tried to hide it. But Thomas caught her wrist, tearing a strip from his shirt and binding the wound firm. The touch was different this time, not fearful, not possessive, but steady, a silent acknowledgement of care. Their eyes met briefly, then broke away. Yet both knew something had shifted. By midday, Thomas ladled warmed beans into bowls. Nayeli sat straight, ate in small, careful spoonfuls, then placed her bowl down gently, as if every bite was precious, without meaning to. Thomas spoke Thomas Hale. "Farm's mine since my father passed it down. Wife's been gone 2 years. He left it there, eyes fixed on his bowl. After a pause, she answered softly, 'Nayeli, nothing more.' The exchange was brief, but the air between them eased, the distance drawn tighter. That afternoon, they turned to the woodpile. Thomas swung the axe, splitting heavy logs, sweat darkening his shirt. He showed her how to stack the pieces neatly, then handed her lighter chunks to carry. She moved slow but steady, her brow damp, her gaze firm. When the task was done, she brushed her forehead, and he caught a spark of determination in her eyes. Not a burden, not a purchase, but a person willing to shoulder the work beside him. Respect stirred quietly in his chest. By evening, the fire glowed in the stove. Thomas sat at the table repairing his boots, while Nayeli sewed the torn seam of her dress with careful, even stitches. Her hands were skilled, quicker than his, each pull of the thread clean and sure. He glanced over and said, "Better than me," for the first time. The corner of her mouth lifted in a fleeting, fragile smile. Silence still held the cabin, but no longer heavy. It was the silence of two people sharing labor, sharing breath, learning each other's ways without need for words. A man who had lost nearly everything, and a woman who had been mocked and broken before a crowd now joined in the simple rhythm of hauling water, setting posts, splitting wood, sewing cloth. That night, as the wind clawed at the shutters, Thomas leaned back in his chair, half asleep, on the bed. Nayeli no longer curled tight with fear. She lay beneath the blanket, her breathing deep, her shoulders loose at last. Inside that small cabin, suspicion remained, but in its place also grew a fragile seed trust. The sun had just cleared the ridge, spilling a thin light across the dark brown fields. Thomas and Nayeli were stacking wood by the porch, readying themselves for the day's labor. Suddenly, the grind of wagon wheels on gravel cut through the quiet, followed by coarse laughter. An old wagon pulled up at the gate. On the seat sat two familiar faces, Silas Boone and his younger brother, Carter. The Boone brothers had long carried a taste for mockery, especially at the expense of those weaker than themselves. They were known across the valley for their sharp tongues, never missing a chance to sneer. Silas spat into the dirt, his narrow eyes squinting against the morning sun, glinting with disdain. Carter chuckled, nudging his brother, as though this trip was nothing more than a morning's entertainment, just to see the prize Thomas Hale had dragged home. Heard you spent your last silver on some burden from the Lo Seamus auction, Silas drawled, letting the words hang. Had to come see for ourselves. Looks like the rumors were right. Nayeli stiffened, her hands clamping down on the piece of wood she carried. Her face paled, and she edged back toward the doorway, pulling Thomas's coat tighter around her shoulders. Her gaze fell to the ground, unwilling to meet the men's prying eyes. Carter grinned, leaning sideways to catch a glimpse into the cabin. That Apache woman. Huh, not worth a penny. Wait till winter, then you'll regret it. Another mouth to feed. No work worth doing. You'll see. Hale. Thomas set the axe down, slowly, then straightened. His face burned hot with shame. He knew the whole valley was already buzzing, and now the ridicule had come straight to his doorstep. But beneath that shame, something stronger rose up the fire to protect. His voice came low but steady. You've seen what you came for. Now get back on your wagon. Silas barked a short laugh. Just reminding you, saving an Apache won't keep you warm when the snow comes. Hunger'll teach you the truth. For a moment. Thomas felt the sting of those words. They echoed his own fears, the seed not bought, the nails left behind, the long, lean winter ahead. But when he turned and saw Nayeli trembling at the door, her dark eyes fixed on his back, as if clinging to him, all that shame hardened into something else. He took a step forward, his voice rising clear. No one touches her while she's here. The words cracked the air like a whip. Carter faltered, glancing at his brother. Silas narrowed his eyes, lips pressed tight. The silence stretched, broken only by the whistle of the wind through the fence line. At last, Silas snorted, tugged the reins. Come on, he muttered. But his look was sharp, promising trouble. The wagon creaked away, wheels grinding over frozen dirt, their laughter trailing faint in the distance. Thomas stood rigid, fists clenched till the knuckles whitened. His heart pounded not with fear, but with the weight of humiliation swallowed, and the resolve he had just spoken aloud. When he turned, Nayeli was still at the doorway, her shoulders trembling. Her eyes caught his, uncertain, searching for an answer he hadn't given. He gave a small nod, his voice low. They won't take you. Not while you're here. She didn't reply. The block of wood slipped from her hand, and she sank onto the porch step, clutching the coat tight. But in her gaze, still shadowed by worry. There flickered something new, a fragile trust. That afternoon, Thomas swung the axe harder than usual, every strike venting the sting of the Boone brothers' mockery. Nayeli sat near the barn, repairing the mule's harness with steady stitches. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was no longer wary. It was the silence of two people who had just weathered a storm together, both knowing they had to stand side by side. That evening, as firelight flickered through the cabin, Thomas sat at the table, the Boone brothers' smirks still burning in his mind. But when Nayeli laid a small cornbread she had baked before him, then pushed half her portion toward his side, something shifted. He stared, then looked up. Her eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "If there isn't enough, we share," she said softly. And in that moment, Thomas knew the protection he had promised was no hollow vow. The world outside might laugh, but inside this cabin, a quiet pact had already been made to endure together, no matter the cost. The snowstorm came sudden, harsher than in years past. Wind howled through the ridges, driving white drifts hard against the cabin walls, making the roof groan under the strain. The wooden door shuddered in its frame, rags stuffed in the cracks doing little to keep out the cutting cold. Thomas fed another log into the stove, flames leaping, the warmth pushing back against the storm's fury. In the corner, Nayeli laid out what little remained of their food, a handful of dry beans, a few potatoes, half a loaf of cornbread baked the day before. Her hands placed each item carefully, as though she were handling silver. Thomas watched, knowing the winter ahead would be long and merciless. Yet in her dark eyes he saw not fear, but resolved the will to make these meager stores last for them both. That night, with the storm raging outside, they sat across the fire. Thomas poured her a measure of black coffee, the last he had saved as a kind of treasure. She accepted, surprised, holding the tin cup close, sipping slowly as if savoring not just the taste, but the warmth itself. For a while there was nothing but the roar of wind and the crackle of wood. Then her voice came, low and steady. "They took me by the river. Hired men. I was torn away from my people." Thomas froze, setting his cup down. He didn't press her with questions. Some wounds were sharp enough to bleed at a whisper. He only gave a small nod, a gesture of listening. After a long pause, he spoke in turn, his voice heavy. "My wife, Clara. Fever took her. 2 winters passed." The words hung in the cabin like weight, but they were not lonely words. They were shared loss. 2 scars shone in the dim firelight. No tears, no lament, only the quiet gravity of grief spoken aloud, and a thread of empathy binding the silence that followed. The next day, snow piled so deep Thomas had to shove the door open with his shoulder. He shoveled a path to the mule's stall while Nayeli tended the fire, counting out beans and cornmeal as if each grain mattered. When he returned, snow clinging to his hair and coat, she stepped forward with a blanket, wrapping it around his shoulders. Thomas paused, startled. Her gaze met his, no longer skittish, but calm, steady, carrying warmth. By afternoon they sat side by side, mending leather straps, patching the old harness. Her hands moved sure and skillful, neater than his. He gave a short laugh. "You've got the better hand for it." She said nothing, only bent lower, but the faint curve at the corner of her lips betrayed a smile. The wariness that once weighed the air had thinned, replaced by a gentler quiet. When night returned, the storm hit harder. The cabin shook, snow striking the shutters as if it would rip them off. Nayeli sat close to the fire, her eyes fixed on the blur outside. Her voice trembled softly. "I lived through a storm like this once, but then I was alone." Thomas shifted closer, his hand gripping the chair rail, eyes fixed on her. He did not reach for her, only spoke, firm as stone. "You're not alone now." She turned, her dark eyes glistening, and for the first time they did not carry fear. She gave a slight nod, a wordless acceptance. In the midst of howling wind, they had found a common ground not in the jeers of a crowd, not on an auction block, but here, in the small cabin where two wounded souls leaned toward one another. That night, when they broke the last piece of cornbread between them, her hand brushed against his. Neither pulled away. The fire flared bright, revealing the truth trust had taken root, and their bond was real. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, a new closeness had already been sealed by the warmth of silence. After 3 days of storm, the wind finally died down. Outside, the land lay buried in white, snow piled deep, silver light glinting through the cabin window. But inside the small wooden room, the fire still burned, the crack of kindling holding fast to life. Thomas sat at the table, mending an old leather strap. His scarred hands moved slow and steady. On the bed, Nayeli brushed out her long black hair, each strand shining in the firelight. The silence between them no longer carried weight. It had taken on the rhythm of familiarity, as though they had lived side by side for years. From time to time, Thomas lifted his head and caught her gaze, and this time, instead of turning away, she let it linger quiet, steady, unafraid. Setting the brush aside, Nayeli rose and walked toward him. Each step on the wooden floor seemed to break the last invisible barrier between them. Standing before him, she hesitated only a breath, then placed her hand lightly on his arm. The touch was gentle, yet enough to make him set down the tool and draw a long breath. "Nayeli," his voice came low, almost as if warning himself. But she did not pull back. Her dark eyes stayed open, certain now, stripped of defense. "I stay," she whispered, the words soft but weighty, spoken in English with the trace of her own tongue. Simple words, yet they fell like a vow. Thomas felt his chest tighten. For years he had lived only with silence and loss, never expecting another beginning. And now, the woman who once trembled in fear stood before him, offering a choice, her own choice, not forced, not bought. He raised his roughened hand and brushed her cheek. Her skin was warm beneath his calloused fingers. Nayeli closed her eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them again, letting the moment hold. And then, their lips met, hesitant at first, testing, but within a breath, the kiss deepened, certain and sure, a pledge spoken without words. Outside, the fields lay white under snow. Inside, the small cabin trembled against the wind, but no barrier remained between them. The caution was gone, replaced by something stronger, belonging not born of need, but of choice. When at last they drew apart, breath still heavy, his forehead rested against hers. Thomas did not speak, but his eyes carried all the weight of a promise. Nayeli smiled, then her first true smile since stepping down from the auction block. That night, they sat close by the fire, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the last of the cornbread. Nayeli's hand found his, and stayed. Thomas felt the warmth spread through him, and in that moment he knew the long years of loneliness had ended. The snowstorm beyond the cabin was only the first trial. Winter would still be long, and spring uncertain, but inside, two souls who had been strangers were now one. No more walls, no more suspicion, only a simple truth: they had chosen each other. Winter gave way slowly. Each day the sun climbed higher at the horizon, casting a warmer gold across the wooden walls. The heavy layers of snow began to split and melt, trickling into thin streams that carved the thawing earth. The ground was still stubborn, but the air carried the scent of spring, of soil waking, of hope yet unnamed. One morning, Thomas Hale pushed open the cabin door, his boots sinking into mud where snow had been. He looked around and saw the roof still standing after the fiercest storm in years. What surprised him most was the calm that filled him. The cabin was no longer a shelter for a lonely man, but a home where a second pair of footsteps and a second breath now belonged. Nayeli stepped out behind him, her dark hair tied back, her old cloak pulled close, her stride light. She lifted her face to the clear sky and let out a quiet laugh, a simple smile bright as spring itself. Thomas glanced at her, and the sight softened the lines of worry carved into his face. In her gaze, he saw something he hadn't dared to look for in years, a future. When the snow cleared enough, they chose to return to town. The road to Lo Seamus was muddy and rutted, but the mule plodded steadily on. Folks turned to watch as they passed. This time Thomas did not lower his eyes or shrink from their stares. He walked upright, steady, and beside him Nayeli sat firm, no longer the bowed, trembling woman on the auction block. Her head was high, her gaze calm. A few who had once laughed kept quiet now, silenced when they met Thomas's eyes. He no longer carried shame, and his presence beside her was proof enough of their choice. The town, like it or not, had to face the truth. At the blacksmith's, Thomas traded a sack of beans for nails. The smith glanced at Nayeli, then at Thomas, but spoke no ridicule. He only nodded, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. Small as it was, to Thomas it felt like a doorway opening acceptance where once there had been mockery. Back at the cabin, the days took on a new rhythm. Thomas mended the mule's shelter, while Nayeli pressed the first kernels of corn into the thawing earth. Her fingers worked carefully, steady with a trust that life would come from this soil. Watching her, Thomas felt something stir that he thought was long gone hope. Evenings brought firelight and quiet meals, a bowl of beans, a piece of cornbread, but no longer eaten in silence heavy with suspicion. Instead, the hush was warm, carrying the comfort of home. When Nayeli reached across the table and laid her hand over his, Thomas didn't draw back. He let his fingers curl around hers, the touch saying all that words could not. From then on, the cabin was no longer a stopgap shelter. It became their home, built not only of logs and stone, but of trust. Thomas rose earlier, not from habit, but with purpose. Nayeli filled the shelves with neat rows, patched clothes, baked bread, humming soft tunes as she worked. At times, Thomas found himself telling her bits of old stories about neighbors, about seasons past, and she listened, her smile turning even the hardest memory lighter. They no longer needed many words, for companionship had become its own language. In each step to the field, in every log split, in each shared meal, their bond deepened. Friends, if you've followed this story to its end, you can feel what I do that peace after the storm is one of life's rarest gifts. Thomas and Nayeli, two souls who seemed unlikely to walk the same path, have found each other, and built a home from ashes and sorrow. But what should their next step be, should Thomas bring Nayeli into the company of kinder neighbors, so she can be recognized as part of the community? Or is it better for them to keep to their own land, living quietly, their lives entwined beyond the reach of others' opinions? If this story has stirred you, if it's reminded you that love and trust can rise from the hardest ground, I invite you tap that like button to keep these frontier tales alive. And leave a comment. What path should Thomas and Nayeli take from here? Your thoughts give these stories strength, keeping them alive in more than just words. Outside, the snow melted into streams, carrying winter away. Inside the cabin, spring had already come, the kind of spring not only born of the earth, but of the heart.